Did you guys get a chance to read this? This is an email I got a week ago. Oh, thanks. That's better. From my kid's school. And, you know, having two kids who play classical instruments, cello, violin, I've gotten these for the last, 8-10 years. They have to wear concert dress, white tops, black bottoms, and black socks underlined. This is really interesting to me. Does anybody have a sense of why that's what concert dress is? What's that about? Shout it out if you have a thought. I mean, it's not a rhetorical question, please.
Black and white and sleek.
Sleek.
Uniformity.
Uniformity. Yeah. That's
Those white socks would just like flash if somebody moved their leg.
no flashing. All right. Yeah, uniformity is what's on my mind about it. There's no right answer, but Carol?
Discipline.
Discipline, yes.
In multiple senses.
Okay.
Prevent distraction from the music itself.
Great, but let's ask ourselves, and that is what musicians say, right? And they still say this, but what is it doing to the music? Does the music sound any different if that's what you're wearing? Or if the people on the stage are wearing that?
It's a holdover from aristocratic heritage of the form.
Aristocratic heritage. Everybody hear that? That's crucial. Yeah.
It's like almost like servers. I mean, working in the past, like as a waiter.
Yeah.
That you wear white
Sure.
top and black pants.
Who else wears tuxedo garb, right? It's servants, yeah, exactly. But a very high class kind of servant, right? So, all right, so these are things that we can either see from within this sort of cultural frame that it sounds natural in, or we can see it from outside that cultural frame and start to ask questions about it. And because you all were so ready with responses about what it is in a critical sense, what it is and what it maybe could be or should be, I want to say that we're already doing that. We as a culture are at a time when this no longer is a kind of de facto unquestioned frame. And there are these wonderful words from anthropology about the emic perspective from within which this is normal, because you as an emic inquirer are sharing the ideas and cultural assumptions of the cultural frame that you're studying. Or an edic perspective in which you are trying to mediate among different kinds of cultures and try to step outside of the norms and the assumptions of that culture to make a kind of interpretation of it that makes sense across cultures. So as the arts begin to think harder and harder about how they reach people for whom the assumptions of historical arts, and to your point, the sort of authoritarian top-down kind of culture that we were used to for the last 100 years gets questioned and isn't natural, we need to step out. And so as researchers, we need to be able to make sense of it within the frame and outside of the frame and sort of come to a balanced, nuanced, critical view, because that's what the audiences that have not accepted that frame yet are doing mentally as well. If you do end up wearing your black socks and your white tops and you buy into the discipline that somebody mentioned, this is kind of what you get. Look at this, look at these faces, and ask yourselves from an edict perspective, from outside, what these faces are telling you about this art form. Look particularly at the first row. Look at this, no smiles, such seriousness, such dourness, such sort of, I don't care if you're taking a picture of me, I don't care if I'm not a performer, I'm just a musician. And there's something about there are some smiles here. I don't know how you can read this guy's personality, but there are things here that are redolent of an ambiguous relationship, or maybe on their part, ambivalent relationship to the audience. This is what kids grow into when they get those emails all their lives. This is a picture from the New York Times that took 5 seconds to find. You can find you can find these pictures easily and readily in Google Images, etc. And the New York Times does these to the extent that I wish that there were time for a study of the images of classical music performers and popular music performers, because these are the faces that you see when you look at classical images in the press. This is the pianist Jeffrey Kahan. That's Daniel Gilbert at the New York Phil. And these are the typical orchestra players. Look at the seriousness. These people could be at a corporate board meeting reading their Blackberries. And look at the downturn of this guy's mouth. This is not a happy performance. And in fact, in some sense, you're not meant to be looking at him at all. He's meant to not be conveying something to you with his face. But Alan Gilbert, they're trying to make a poster child at the New York Phil. The branding campaign around him, sponsored with bank money, is quite striking. They're trying to turn him into a personality, but he comes from a position and a tradition in which personality was supposed to be absent. You were supposed to get out of the way and let the music speak. So what we're talking about to some extent is, okay, whatever they're playing, let's say it's a Beethoven concerto, that's culture with a capital C, right? But what we have to think about, and I'm trying to direct us toward, because it becomes more and more important in my own work every year, is the culture, small c, of culture. And so the fact that they're not smiling is perhaps, I think, the most human and the least talked about issue in this classical realm. But as you'll see, it's redolent of what's going on. We're now able to, in fact, we're not able any longer to ignore as a culture, because of where we stand historically, that they are not smiling. I want to point out that we know where this started roughly, and this wasn't the case always. Here's a quote from a book, a wonderful book by Alex Ross of The New Yorker, in which he talks about the moment in the very last years of the 19th century and the very first few years of the 20th, in which Gustav Mahler, who was the music director at the opera in Vienna, made some real draconian changes. So let me just read this to you. Opera houses of the 19th century were rowdy places. Mahler, who hated all extraneous noise, threw out singers' fan clubs, cut short applause between numbers, glared icily at talkative concert goers, and forced latecomers to wait in the lobby. In other words, he created the very concert system that you all know. Beverly? Okay, it's interesting. Emperor Franz Joseph, though, the embodiment of old Vienna, was heard to say, "Is music such a serious business?" This is Carol's word, serious, right? "I always thought it was meant to make people happy." So we'll get back to what he was surprised, why he was surprised, and what had preceded this. But it's worth thinking about the shift, if it is indeed a unilateral or unidirectional shift. We can talk about that. But it's worth asking ourselves whether it's natural within all cultural frames, certainly within yours, Beverly, if that's what you're saying, right?
Throw the coffers out.
Throw the coffers out. Interesting. All right. There is a revolution afoot. Classical Revolution is an organization that barely counts as an organization. They have a website. They have chapters in about 30 US cities and about a handful of other cities in Europe and elsewhere. And this is what classical music looks like. This is a black and white photo, but don't mistake it as old. This is recent. Look at the energy. Look at the stance there. And he's now doing something with his violin or viola, I can't see the scale, that this guy at the piano wasn't expecting. So there's some spontaneity going on in this photo and a kind of natural smile from the cellist. This is a moment in which something is happening. Now the audience member still has his chin in his hand. So there's something about it we can read on all kinds of levels. This is another classical revolution photo. Notice the energy, the attitude, the kind of stance they have with respect to their relationship to the photograph, to the photographer, meaning to you. They're performing even when they're not performing. And I would say in a natural way. I tend to like this, and I'll admit my biases. They're holding a Beethoven score, though. So remember, this isn't about doing a different thing called culture, capital C. This is about doing culture differently, right? So more classical photos from Classical Revolution. This guy's wearing a flannel shirt. There are people in the background not listening or also listening while they're eating. There's a social embeddedness to this. We have the same sort of feel here in a coffee house or bar. A smile from this woman. This may be a rehearsal. They call these classical jams sometimes. Sometimes there's even improvisation, which was eschewed from the classical establishment at the beginning of the 20th century or over the course of those decades. And look at this. Less a boundary between the performer and the audience afterward. You can see this at some classical performances now, but it's rare. And just a more domestic setting. They call this chamber music. The part of the tagline, I forgot exactly what it is, but chamber music for the people, I believe, is what Classical Revolution's. And this is beer. This is hugely important because the arts had been set aside from regular life and from regular social interchange for so long that to think about it as being reconnected to the things that we do for pleasure, including drink and socialize, is really, really striking. Now this may look like a performing arts photo, but we're not in the domain of the arts when I show you this, and I want to switch to a different sort of topic that weaves in a very similar path through contemporary cultural shifts. This is a science program. This is a program called Nerd Night, and the slogan here, among others, is "Talk nerdy to me." What we've got here is this thing that this guy Matt Wasowski started with a buddy. The slogan underneath their logo is "Be there and be square." So inverting the traditional 20th century notion of be there or be square. And it's science with scientists and young, sometimes young scientists, sometimes middle-aged and older, doing talks in a very informal way over beers and with people sitting on floors at various venues around. I think he's in 47 cities, Nerd Night. And this is part of a trend to connect to science as a form of cultural engagement and entertainment in a new way. They mix, in this case, acrobats doing the structure of ethanol molecules. There's a scientist doing that. They do some musical ones, but they do typically stories. Now, story becomes a really important notion in Story Collider, another contemporary science project that is a podcast as well as a live series of events, mostly in New York, some in Boston, founded by this guy, Ben Lilly. Betty, you mentioned Curator, the Museum Journal. I interviewed Ben in a recent issue about the relationship between story and the storytelling revival and science. I'm happy to send you guys the PDF if anyone's interested. And what Story Collider is doing is taking personal narrative, which is a booming sort of cultural phenomenon now that is evidenced in The Moth, which got a big MacArthur grant. The Moth, do you all know The Moth? Okay, so this is a kind of spin-off of The Moth because Ben was aware of what was going on in terms of scientists needing to and feeling a new need culturally to reach out to their audiences, not to say, I'm going to edify you and teach you about theoretical physics or whatever, but I'm going to tell you a story about how science affected my life. And these are very personal stories. They sometimes are very funny. There's a relationship between stand-up comedy and that world and the sort of open mic feel of these. These are curated, though, and rehearsed. But they feel very spontaneous, and they have four-letter words, and they construe a kind of adult audience for a moment of peer-to-peer sort of sharing about science as culture. And just to show you about what this is in terms of personal exposure, you do not feel that the scientist in these stories is trying to get out of the way, as I accuse some of those musicians of doing. This is a guy named Jack. This is the Story Collider magazine. Jack Rodolico confronts his lifelong fear of sharks when he joins the crew of the SS Robert Siemens. This is a new thing because scientists used to, I don't have a bunch of slides showing the past or the sort of tradition of science communication, but it's generally still evaluated as, and used to be very much socially construed as, a form of passing on facts and telling science stories that weren't about the storyteller. Now we have the presence of the storyteller in the equation. So what I've been saying, I guess, is science is culture too, and we can also say, especially from that edict perspective, science has a culture too. This, as you may all remember if you're my age or older, is Marlon Perkins from Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. He was a very genial host, and I don't mean to decry this, I loved it as a kid, but you could watch those shows for 10 seasons and still not know a damn thing about Marlon Perkins, right? Okay, what do you got now? Neil Tyson has become a kind of phenomenon culturally. You're smiling, you know Neil. I mean, you know of.
He's great on the Daily Show.
He's great on, he's on the Daily Show. What's that?
He's great everywhere.
He's great. I agree. He's a great deal of fun, and he's become an internet meme. There's a meme generator online where you can caption these photographs. That's not my caption. But these drawings have become, and he's in this YouTube video still, imitating what he saw online as the memification of himself. So there's some kind of upwelling of cultural interest in this kind of science, not so much in the topics that he cares about, but I think in the personal and social experience that we're having with people like Neil. His show, StarTalk Radio, is awesome. I think it's one of my favorite podcasts. And this is some of the photographs from the live tapings that he does in Brooklyn. For some reason, Brooklyn is the center of this set of universes we're talking about today. And look at him goofing around. This is Bill Nye, the science guy, who represents just a previous generation of science communicator. And Neil cozying up to him, goofing with this guy's T-shirt and joking. And they're drinking too, and that's huge. They're drinking because that's part of what's going on stage. It's part of what's going on in the audience as well. So StarTalk is quite part of the 21st century. Stepping back for a moment, what are we saying about 21st century participation? I want to take these and abstract them, and as someone accused me of generalizing, that's absolutely right. I'm going to try to do that in a way that still stays open to what's going on, that's still 20th century in its values. So we've seen that this kind of culture can be very informal, that it can be playful. I want to try to resuscitate, with respect to the arts, some of the meanings of the word play that are etymologically buried and very interesting that are no longer associated with high culture or so-called serious culture. We go to a play, you play a part, you play an instrument. There's something about that word that we've lost the sense of playfulness in association with those usages. That it's very social, and we can talk about where these all came from, that it's grassroots, that there's this sort of bottom-up participatory kind of feel to the culture that we're seeing in both science and the arts. I mentioned participatory, so grassroots can also be an alternative to the notion of institutional, and we'll see that in a second. So what was all this in the 20th century? And again, oversimplifying for the sake of discussion, that there was this formality to high culture and to science approximately for the 20th century. That the word serious, as Carol said, was this sort of antecedent to what is now being construed as playful and fun, and that there was a contemplative element, so that you weren't just there to connect with each other, you were there to connect in some direct, perceptual way, some receptive way to what was going on stage. And it was an aesthetic contemplation in the arts, the idea that you had this unmediated direct encounter with the artwork or the performance. And we'll get to whether that's worth challenging now. It was institutional rather than grassroots, and Nick Rapkin, who's not here today, and I wrote a paper recently that we're revising that talks about the sort of rise of the institutional culture of the nonprofit arts system in the 20th century and how it is being challenged to some extent by what's going on in the grassroots. And finally, that it valued professionalism and quality, the notion of world-class professionalism, that these people who were doing the science communication or doing the arts making were at the top of their game. They'd studied for decades. They were refined machines, in the case of the orchestral musicians in particular, for creating professional culture. But that's now being challenged by what feels like a different set of values around participation. Yes?
It's interesting, if you look at the 20th century list there, one of the striking things is that academia was professionalized and made much more serious.
Yes.
At the exact same period
Yes.
as the arts went through the same process of professionalization.
Right. We're going to add to this list, and I'm going to ask you if you think it describes not just the arts and the public sciences, but sort of how culture has shifted broadly, politics, journalism, media, things like that.
But it's also, there's a the term canon should come under 20th century, that there's a very strict canon.
A sense of canonicity, there was a canonical set of, right.
Learn to be socially acceptable and to gain the respect of
Yes, this will never be a comprehensive list. Yes?
I might suggest as well that one difference between the 20th and 21st century there would be that there is often a place in the 21st century values, as we're generalizing them, for those other things as well, whereas the set of values to the left doesn't offer room for the set of values to the right. I think an increased tolerance of learning styles.
Oh, that's interesting. It's interesting. So it's what the tech world would call backward compatible, that you can value these things and still care occasionally about these, but not necessarily the other way around. Fascinating. Yeah, please.
On a related note, to what extent is is this shift into the 21st century as a shift of substitution, or is it an emergence of an alternative?
You'll see me put those kinds of words up, and I don't know. I mean, I tend to slip into a simplistic notion that we've moved from X to Y, and that's the direction in which all this is going, but I don't know really, and I'm open to the idea that this stuff will stick around for a very long while. And that we may not be so much moving toward as broadening to include, okay? So we'll get back to that, and I want to complete the list a little bit. So this is exactly, you're one slide ahead of me, shifting or just broadening our notions of what constitutes viable contemporary culture and science. I want to ask you guys, because most of my clients, as Betty started to allude, are sort of large, prestigious cultural institutions, because they're the kind who can afford to spend a little money on consultants and researchers. But the system, based on these organizations that arose at the end of the 19th and the early and all of the 20th century, is having some trouble navigating, I think, what I've called simplistically for the moment these shifts. So here's the Hayden Planetarium. Neil Tyson runs the Hayden Planetarium, but it's part of the American Museum of Natural History. It's got this very formal structure, right? It's got a kind of built environment for a certain form of science engagement. And it's got some flexibility challenges. This is the main hall. This is the famous asteroid, and it is, as the mid 20th century and late 20th century cultural critics accuse museums of being, it's a disciplinary kind of institution. You may or may not take it that way as you go in, but there are certain things you can do in a museum and a science center, and there's certain things you can't. So you have people with their arms folded, people with their hands to their cheek. You have a kind of body language of kind of distance from or respect for the experiences around them. And the guard, always the guard. And people, when you do research with new audiences who don't go to cultural institutions that often, and Beverly can tell you this, they talk about the guards, especially with respect to art museums. The other thing you can do here is sit back and enjoy the content that is being presented to you, in this case, in the Sky Show, the theater at AMNH. Now, I'm not saying these aren't powerful experiences or that there's not a lot of learning going on and a lot of intergenerational connection that goes on. These are very powerful, positive memories for most people who we study in the context of natural history museums. But there's something else that this museum is now trying to do. Maybe with Neil Tyson's energy, and maybe it would have done it anyway. A rap artist coming in and doing a live show of fun music in the same hall that shows that space film. Or you can bring in a hip string quartet and do some classical type music with big visuals that you can't do anywhere else. And you can invite, as so many museums of all types have done, young professionals, young adults to come in and have a drink in the gallery spaces and connect in a different vibe with the cultural offering there, or the scientific offering. But ask yourselves as we go through some of these, whether they're fighting against their built environment. Here's the San Francisco Symphony's hall in San Francisco, obviously. And it is all about a notion of spectacle and about the sort of prestige and the temple of culture, that when this institution tries to do something contemporary, it has it's starting from a tough place. So what it did among other orchestras these days is it invited a non-professional, you can tell because she's smiling, to come in something called the Community of Music Makers, which is like the Baltimore Symphony's Rusty Musicians program and a handful of others around the country, in which they play side by side with the orchestra musicians in a way that's sort of just for fun. There's no audition, and it brings as the Rusty Musicians label says, brings this sort of amateur out of one's past, right? You studied as a kid, you may have played in college, but you haven't done anything, and you're a stockbroker, but you can come in and play classical music with the big boys. Baltimore Symphony did this as well. The BSO Academy has been written up several times in the New York Times, side by side with the pros. And this is another set of informal photos of non-musicians, or amateur musicians, I should say, interacting with their professional peers. If you're the Old Globe Theater in San Diego, and you've got this sort of old world theater in the very classic sense, right? This is supposed to evoke Stratford-upon-Avon in England. What do you do? Well, among other things, and this is a trend, you can do theater with your communities. This is a production of The Odyssey adapted by 2 professional theater artists, but starring 200 people, 3 of whom were professional actors and singers. So this is community choruses, church groups, working with and in kind of collaboration and consultation with an arts institution that had been, to those communities, pretty much irrelevant. This is being done in various ways at theaters, at opera companies, and it's still siloed in the education department, but it's going on, and it represents a shift, as we saw from that professionalism to participatory kind of slide. If you're the Plains Art Museum, I'll just breeze through this example, you can do a crowdsourced exhibit, which is happening a lot. You're probably all very familiar with it, a democratic approach to the museum collection. The trouble with some of these is that they end up looking, and this is, again, mine, Beverly, you may disagree, others may disagree, they end up looking and feeling like the traditional art exhibition on an experiential level. So here's the person with her hands behind her back in the classic museum. When else do you do that than when you're in an art museum? Taking a photo, which is the form of interaction that museums are getting comfortable with, hands in the pockets or at one's sides, respectfully reading and looking, and all of this is great for a certain kind of engagement with the arts, but it isn't necessarily a kind of institutional evocation of the values on the right side of that slide. but it is a step toward it. So I guess what I'm saying about these institutions is that they're having some trouble making this shift or getting comfortable with what it might mean to make that shift. This is a slide of the science festival logos, because science festivals are what some science museums are trying to do in response to these shifts that gets them out of their own walls, gets them into parks, into alternative venues, gets them into some new audiences in fun ways. And this science festival alliance claims that there's this, and I believe it, a great proliferation right now of science festivals. Part of that interest is in the kind of ideas festival, sort of thinkers and talkers of the TED ilk. This is Bobby McFerrin at the World Science Festival that Brian Greene runs in New York. And here's a more sort of typical outreach-based effort to engage kids at a science festival elsewhere. So institutions are working toward this. But I want to say about a very important pair of trends that I think epitomizes some of the new values in a fresh way that is quite radical. Do you guys know does anyone know who these people are?
Is that Radiolab?
It's Radiolab. Excellent. This is Robert Krulwich and this is Jad Abumrad, and their show Radiolab has done probably more than any single cultural phenomenon right now to offer a different sense of what science communication can be and feel like. It's about their relationship to some extent. It's about their arguments. It's about their personal feelings, their emotions with respect to the stories that they hear and tell. And it's about their fun with it and their humor and their connection to the scientists that they interview. It's science that operates on almost entirely on the right side of the spectrum that we're creating. Planet Hunters is an example of citizen science that's going on online in a way that is quite bottom-up and quite sort of community-based, because by just having the kind of brain that's between your that's inside your cranium and having a pair of eyes, you can do work that no computer can do. We can all do it because we're simply better at it at this stage in our evolution and the computer's evolution. And the Planet Hunters is an example of something under the Zooniverse umbrella. And Zooniverse has a dozen of these or more of these projects at any one time, in which people participate in real scientific research by classifying or diagnosing or identifying or doing the things that people are good at and computers are not yet. And so to return to this slide, we can add a few more things that these efforts demonstrate. One is that there's a real shift going on now between the product of science or the arts, meaning the final thing, the worked out, finished, polished performance, versus the process of getting there. So art museums are now having a greater and greater impulse to bring in artist for artist talks, to show artists at work. And what science is doing here has everything to do with what the festivals are about and what Radiolab is about in terms of understanding the scientific story, this story not only of what is known, but how it got known and what it means to the person who got it known. That science and the culture, the arts are now embedded in a messy way with everyday life. And they used to be construed as a kind of specialized realm apart, and if you'll forgive the attitude here, on a pedestal, right, in a kind of sacred space. So they've moved into the marketplace. And then a couple more. There's a value around spontaneity here and unscriptedness that is hugely important. And I think one could do a whole talk or paper or even maybe a book about the difference between the control and discipline, somebody used the word discipline before, of scripted communication, which is what the Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom was and so many other shows, Sagan included, although he was very good off the cuff, to something spontaneous, unscripted, as in these Story Collider shows or Nerd Night, where you're just, as I'm trying to do now, talking to people and look them in the eye and say something that comes to your mind that's in that moment. And finally, and this one is my favorite, the world of these kind of cultural productions has become very much engaged in subjectivity as opposed to objectivity. And I'll say that in the 20th century, again, oversimplifying, there was this great focus on the art object, right, or the scientific fact, and pretty much forget about the relationship between the teller of that tale and his content. And I think what we've done in two senses is move towards subjectivity. I'll get to your question in one second. One is our own subjectivity, as in what's important isn't just what's on stage, it's our relationship to what's on stage, how it affects us. So it becomes much more relational. And the other sense of subjectivity is what I mentioned a second ago, which is, what does it mean to you, Mr. Scientist? Or what does it mean to you, Daniel Barenboim on the podium, this music? Don't hide, be a mediating force, be a factor. And so the notion that they could step out of the way and that we were just somehow unmediated in our connection to the content is, I think, being challenged in some very fertile ways. Please.
This could be a very hasty question, but why do you think these changes are happening now, not like 20 years ago, and
Right.
this is part of like their economic practices, actually pushing them to bring some more audience, or?
Well, I'm not sure that your second part of your question assumes that the cultural institutions are driving this change. I'm not sure. I think they're both adapting to it and driving it in some small ways. Mostly, I think, adapting to it. But I would like to know from you guys why it's happening now, and whether, as most people seem to think, it starts with technology, with the technological revolution that decentralized the means of production and control. I think one of the challenges that we have with something like this is that it has an antecedent that we don't think about a lot. We compare the 21st century to the 20th century, and we say all this stuff is sort of new, or it's vexed and it's challenging. But there was a past. The before had a before, and we're going to look at that. I just saw an article last week in the Atlantic about the great Wikipedia revolution. What if it was actually a reversion? And this article goes on to ask, and I'll just read bits of this, if you sort of want to know what's genuinely new about Wikipedia and what falls in line with historical patterns, you have to compare it beyond the Encyclopedia Britannica to place it in a longer time frame. You can't just go to the 20th century. It seems that the historical anomaly was not today's online collaboration and that whole ethos of bottom-up culture, but the 20th century's professionalized, bureaucratically produced tomes. And then it goes on to sort of offer a broader statement of that. This seems to be true of many of the internet's innovations. Blogs look like 18th and 19th century publishers more than they do the New York Times or the Washington Post. Small crafters selling their wares on Etsy look more like earlier markets than the 20th century's big chains. So we have a tendency to reach for the most recent historical examples as our benchmarks, but when you take a longer view, you see that we haven't so much as broken with the past as repeated it. So note, the anomaly may be, in this diagram, the middle column, because before that, until the late 19th century, you had values that were more or less analogous to the values we see today. The 18th century, it's messy commercial marketplace before the rise of the nonprofit arts institution and before the full sort of professionalization of the sciences even. So it's really interesting to think about whether we're returning now, and this is a paper that, as Betty well knows, that Nick and I have been trying to work out, where the cultural hierarchy of the 20th century is now giving way to the kind of messiness and fragmentation in a healthy, I think, sense of the 21st. Okay, a couple more things, and then I want to make sure we just open it up to conversation. The risk for cultural institutions that were premised in the 20th century is enormous right now, and I have a great deal of empathy for our clients and what they're going through. The leaders of arts organizations now, and maybe particularly the boards of arts organizations and some science organizations, got their training, solidified their values, and sort of came to their assumptions in the 20th century era that we've been talking about in this middle column. What else was buried in the 20th century? What else is still in the 20th century? Any thoughts? What else would keep these institutions from just saying, oh, good, we get it, we're going to do this 21st century thing? Patrons. Good. You had a...
metrics of evaluation based on...
Evaluation frameworks are still along this lines, especially in the sciences. Interestingly, the arts are a little bit ahead. Yes, I would say it's revenue. That's where their model still lies, professionally and sort of financially. They're still getting these audiences in the door to some extent. And yes, are they aging? There's some argument about that. But it's fascinating to think that the things that even the most progressive thinkers who are working at these arts organizations are wrestling with have a kind of tether on them, pulling them toward the revenue model. Because it's hard to make money out of this participatory stuff. There's a reason this is feeling like indie culture, right? And indie culture is not about big lavish galas and enormous budgets. All right, so I just want to say one quick other thing about this same article. It used a great word that helped me sort of click some things into place, and I want to share it with you. Does anybody know who this artist was? Sorry?
Looks like a termite.
It's termites. It's exactly right. So I gave you a disingenuous question. It's a collective. It's an art collective called a termite colony, right? And there's this wonderful word for this that I'm just wrestling with. It's stigmergy. And stigmergy is a form of self-organization in which complexity arises from individual autonomous agents acting in their own sort of interest, but in following traces that have been laid down already by others. So this, we're all familiar with the pheromones. E.O. Wilson had pheromones spell out his name, and the ants followed along that path and spelled it out. Termites work in the same way. Each autonomous agent, without any master plan, is building this structure by following their own impulse, right? And that impulse is to some extent determined by the people, the units, the agents that came before it. Complexity obviously can arise out of this, and purposefulness can arise out of this, even though no one of the agents has purpose. It's the exact opposite. So a mechanism of spontaneous indirect coordination between agents or actions where the trace left in the environment by an action stimulates the performance of a subsequent action, to be formal about it. And to say that it's obvious that there's structure here because it looks so damn similar to something that came very much from the top down, from one genius mind, right, with a guy with, literally, Gaudi had a manifesto, and he was the sort of master of a huge group of people who were working, without their own autonomy, but with a master plan from above, okay? Now, I borrowed this comparison from this guy, Daniel Dennett, who I saw talk in Santa Fe a week ago, and he did not use this word stigmergy, but he showed these two, and he's very interested in evolution and cultural memes and all that we could get into. But it makes me wonder if culture itself is stigmergic, and that it's worth just sort of wrapping up with this, and then I have some thoughts about research and its role here. Daniel Levitin writes about music. He wrote This Is Your Brain on Music, and he has a more recent book in which he writes, new forms of music are being invented from earlier forms every day. Slight alterations in the genetic structure, again, the power of these biological metaphors, of one song leads us to a new one. Mozart, Brahms, even great-granddaddy Bach took many of their melodic ideas from ballads, bards, European folk music, children's songs. I guess this started to get me, it got me thinking that we have had, at least in the beginning of my career and for a century or so, this notion that culture is authored, that it emerges from geniuses and from large nonprofit cultural institutions, science the same way, the great minds, the great men, and comes down to us, and that we have this sort of separateness from it, right? But a stigmergic view of culture, I think, tells us that it's all of us, that there's no object-subject difference, that we're all the doers and makers of culture. And I think one thing we could think about as we ask ourselves about the role of research in all of this is what is the way we can understand how people want to be participating in and are capable of participating in culture, and how do we have to redefine this word culture to open it up to this sense that it's what we all do, that we're all participants in it, and that the difference between a genius artist and a stockbroker who happens to play the violin or viola for fun isn't so much a category difference as potentially a kind of difference of degree and role. But beauty and complexity can clearly arise from all that. I have two other slides about research and what's happening in cultural research, but I want to make sure we have time for more discussion. And if you students in particular want to talk about the sort of next needs in social research in culture and science and all of that, I'm happy to do that.
I was going to mention that I've also been thinking about the parallels with research, and all of which kind of comes out of this switch from modernistic or almost positivistic philosophy to postmodernism. Mm-hmm. The idea that the researcher can actually be out of the way, mm-hmm. And hide oneself is,
yes.
And now the fact that, the researcher plays a role in the process of collecting data and that kind of. But the other thing I was going to mention is that the way it's been talked about so far, it's almost as if we're talking about the arts organizations and the museums that are kind of stuck in this 20th century model. But what I've seen over and over again is that the audiences are also stuck in that model.
Mhm.
So the institutions that are trying to move into this 21st century framework have to fight with the fact that we've trained audiences for, you know, a century now,
Yeah.
and how to behave and what to expect. Like the idea of the canon and almost this Gnosticism that of, you know,
Huh.
you have to have a certain kind of knowledge that's almost a secret knowledge
Yeah.
to be able to go to a symphony, but you know, how do we then open that back up
Right.
and retrain audiences?
Right. You're making two really great points. Did everybody hear Charisse? You can hear her over there? So one is that postmodernism pointed out that the whole notion of objectivity was always false objectivity, never really existed. And the other is that the audiences are trained, and this is why I say to some extent the revenue model is still based here. They're still trained in what constitutes these 20th century values. And by the way, they have a lot of clout, right? I mean, it's very hard to look at a leader of an arts organization when you're somebody in a research capacity and say, but it doesn't have to be like that, sir. And we need to say that to our clients. So one thing, I mean, picking up where Charisse just spoke from, if you guys are going into, if any of you students here are going into research in this field, you need to not be intimidated by this sort of the cultural power of these values that still lingers, and maybe for good reason lingers, but you need to be able to say some of the important questions are over here. You know, this is where the forward-looking sort of vexed questions really lie, or at least at their boundary or the relationship between these two. At least that's my bias. Yes?
Do you think that programs like the Rusty Musicians and other symphony programs represent symphonies reconceiving fundamentally of their mission, or do you think of them more as sort of then doing these peripheral side projects to show the community, look how we're engaging, now you should come and subscribe? Like
the latter, except that some of these projects are explicitly disconnected from building future audiences. They're about being perceived as a more relevant institution to the community, or more community-connected institution. Particularly the Old Globe and doing theater with the people who live in the areas around their scene shop and around their theater. But I think for the most part, it's the latter. I mean, they're not fundamentally rethinking right now. And they will tell you that. The leaders of these large cultural organizations that are doing these innovative projects will say, look, this is happening in a pretty discrete, protected realm. This is contained innovation. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I also think that in the 20th century, the study that was just published out of here suggests a lot of palaces to the arts that are also, like you say, arts institutions. They're physically large spaces to fill. Yeah. And so the rethinking of the way that we're building spaces to engage smaller audiences, more intimate audiences, right, and all of that, but also getting back to revenue, it's also the funding community and what the funding community funds. And so all of the institutions, both large and small, that are guiding their programming towards funding and right, data and ticket sales and all of that. Yeah. And a lot of these palaces to the arts were free for a really long time in the 20th century. And so the museums were free. And so it was also, the Art Institute was free for how long? The Smithsonian is still free, and I also think that now people are thinking about what's worth their money and worth their time. So if you're going to spend $15 doing something, it should take more than an hour, right? Like, how much is an hour worth? Right. And so I think these you have a large organization that's charging $15. I can spend a day at the Art Institute, great, but I could also go to galleries for free. Yeah. And I've been thinking a lot about the opera, the Met doing movie of the opera, and thinking about how somebody who's kind of like in Kentucky going to the movies to see the Met, and how that feeds local community opera organizations, right, and that there's something happening in the smaller organizations potentially feeding off of the large ones, and that the large ones can take a step and make things maybe more accessible so that people remember they like the opera, yeah, and remember that it's worth a $30 ticket. Huh. But maybe it's not a $70 ticket. But if you pay $15 to see a $70 opera in a movie theater, yeah, how does that affect you remembering that you enjoy that experience and right, engaging on it on a smaller level locally?
That's a great research question.
Well,
yeah. I mean,
I think about it a lot.
There are some audiences that have declined for local cultural organizations when the Met movies came to town. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't necessarily work in the direction you're talking about, but we need to know more about how that's experienced and perceived by audiences. And that is a potentially really disruptive innovation, that Met HD Live.
I think so.
Yeah. Other thoughts, questions, challenges, disagreement? Yes?
I think the other thing that strikes me with the 21st century model that you're proposing, or sort of thinking through it, it seems to me that much of what you put up there is lower sort of cost of entry, barriers than the 20th century model, and I still sort of wonder about.
Sorry, the 20th century was lower cost of entry?
No, the 21st is lower
yes.
than what we saw in the 20th, and
right.
Yet, you also had sort of comments about sort of, okay, this 21st century model is indie and sort of low budget, and so I sort of wonder about this question of what does support of the arts look like in this 21st century model? What is there to where are resources that are going to be needed regardless of lower cost of entry to support this and keep this going?
Well, part of the answer is Kickstarter. I mean, a lot of these projects, especially in the sciences and very much in certain art forms as well, have been funded by the crowd. Now, we don't know if those are also arts donors to their local symphony and art museum. They could well be, but they could also be people for whom culture meant that's for somebody else, That too is an unresearched area. I mean, part of my question, and I had a couple slides about research that we don't need to get to, but is what are the audience research questions? You asked about evaluation frameworks. I think that's huge. And you're talking about sort of, assumptions we make or could make about the ways these new programs affect audience perceptions or ability to support, desire to support. This is open field. I mean, the kinds of questions we're asking as a field right now are the kinds of questions that my firm, is getting paid to ask aren't quite these questions yet. They're starting to be. And I'll tell you one very hopeful thing is that funders, particularly some big, very progressive funders like Irvine in California and Rockefeller in New York. Rockefeller's all over the world and they have deep pockets, but their cultural funding is in New York. And the NEA to some extent, although it's not putting a ton of research money behind this, are starting to ask these questions in a really progressive way that goes way past what their own grantees and the trustees and leaders of these arts organizations that they fund are comfortable with. So it's a fascinating moment in which philanthropy is sort of leading the charge and has been termed coercive philanthropy lately. You had another thought, or Beverly? No. Yes?
I wonder why, when you gave this presentation, the arts is discussed in the same breath as the sciences in terms of value.
Yeah.
Well, science has I would argue, a more objective value to it in the sense that it does affect, or the understanding process of it does affect all of us as a human race. But in terms of art, the beauty and utility of stand-up comedy, for example, is not the same for everybody.
Right.
In the same way that different kinds of movies mean different things to different people.
Right.
And so in that sense, there is sort of a right for everyone to exist.
Yeah.
But they also have every right to die with a certain dignity if the community is not there. And so I wonder why, when you think about the audience research, why do you lob together in terms of articulating value? Art and science,
That's really interesting. And there are, the sciences are looking to the arts for new ways of connecting to audiences. Now, there's something silly in that, in the sense that they're looking to some extent by doing they're looking to organizations that have had their own audience development problems and their own perception problems. But they're looking to art forms like storytelling that are reemerging in the culture to do a different kind of job with science communication. And I think the arts have looked for the last couple decades at the sciences as with a wish that they, the arts, would be perceived as important to the culture as science. Science is not the first thing to get cut in the schools. The arts are, and why is that? And why is the typical grant to a science museum much larger than the typical grant to an art museum from a funder? So there's this, but there's an interesting intersection right now because the arts are about creativity and innovative expression and thinking. Sciences, if you abstract them a little bit, are about that too. And the question of the relationship between the arts and innovation and science and innovation are creating a new common ground for a discussion that just wasn't going on even 20 years ago. About creativity and its sort of common presence in the arts and the sciences. But for me, it's just about the fact that these are two cultural domains that I'm fascinated by. They're probably worth 10 others that I didn't focus on. For instance, journalism, that one could talk about in exactly these terms. Food, you could talk about in some of these terms. So I just think they're interesting bellwethers. Other thoughts? What do you guys think the right, sorry, your question, and then I'll ask you guys one.
I guess in a way I don't want to ask this because it sounds like I'm kind of just taking the conservative stance of, well, where do we draw the line? of like when how dispersed can cultural consumption and production get before it's actually just kind of people living their lives.
Yeah.
And so it is shopping at a mall an act of choosing, picking your identity and selecting the clothes that you want. And what if music lovers start, if we accept that, well, they find out about new music while they're shopping at Old Navy, and they most enjoy classical music riding in elevators, is that acceptable to us as cultural consumption and interaction, and so are we kind of in a way just hollowing out what it is that we're advocating for?
That's the fear, and I'm not sure I'm advocating, by the way, but that's really interesting, and that's the question I'm asking here. Should culture with a capital C, the arts, follow little c culture, what's going on empirically, or should it try to lead? Any thoughts on this question? It's a great question. Yes?
I became a little uncomfortable immediately when you said, where do we draw the line? I don't know why we're drawing any lines. If this culture doesn't end at any point, we're not headed toward 2313 or anything like that. So why are we trying to figure out a fixed point for things when it's more about a process of change as the human race does?
And that's why I said, like, I hesitated to ask the question, because I also don't agree with that. But then in a sense, it's like, well, why would we bother speaking about this when basically whatever outcomes or the outcomes, and people will do what they want to do with their time, and people making their own choices is valued, and then we kind of don't need to get together 60 people in one room and talk about it, because we should just let them do what they want to do.
Because suppose that's the EMIC question. The EMIC question, if you're in the arts world, and I don't know if you are or not, but a lot of us are, and my whole sort of professional structure is based on the fact that there's this system that needs to understand its audiences. I'm trying to, in a talk like this, step outside of the day-to-day project questions that we've got and sort of think about the big picture of evolution. But if I'm one of those clients, I'm very worried about this, and you're right, there's an advocacy question, there's a kind of strategy question. Those are different, but they're big. What do you guys think? Are these leading indicators what I've been showing, or are they just a widening of what's possible, and we're going to have a kind of complex system in which 20th century values and 21st century values kind of cohabit and cross-pollinate for a while?
Well, Peter, one of the things that you started to mention was relevance or irrelevance, and which is connected to accessibility and inaccessibility. I think there's a feeling that those audiences that didn't have access to some of that 20th century model should have access, and that there's a desire for less stratification among those different segments of society, and how does art and science and culture with either C help to bring that together?
That's well said, but I don't know the answer. Other I want to let you guys go. Do you want to ask this?
I was going to respond to your
Please.
question. Also, I think this fundamental shift versus the widening of the possible. I think looking sector to sector, different art form to art form, I think we'll see very different things.
Yes, maybe so.
I think in certain areas, the cohort effect will play a huge role. When I go to see theater, I'm always shocked at the average age.
Is what, older or younger?
Older.
Yeah. You're talking about nonprofit theater that.
Where's in the visual, arts? We may be seeing more of a widening of the possibility.
Great. These are wonderful questions, and I'm glad it was a discussion more or less along the way. So, if you have any other thoughts, please come up and let's chat. And
or come into the culture.
Oh, right, we have to get out of the room.
This is a classroom.
Yeah, we'll just be down the hall.
5 more minutes, so
Great. Thank you, guys.
Sandwich.
Thank you. Thanks.